In this video, we're going to take a look at Sailor Bungubox Spider Lily. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is a true red. As true as a red has ever been. There's no shading, just a beautiful, consistent red. Though there is a little bit of tone variation depending on what pen you put it into, it's not like what's happening is adjusting performance, just how dark it is, which is good to be able to sort of predict some of that for yourself while you're using it. Seeing this ink makes me wish that Bungubox inks were more affordable to get a hold of. And that's where I run into my own difficulty, which is a me difficulty. I don't use enough red to need to get another bottle of red ink. Though, if I had any need or want for more red ink, I would really want this. And I think it is a little darker than what we saw last week with the Celebration Red, which was the reason that I hinted towards this. Because it depends. Red is just, I don't know, not for me, but not all the time. I do occasionally use it. This is one that I would want to be using. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Noodler's Charlie. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, it gives a very nice, consistent red throughout. It's a little lighter than would be my overall preference for it, but it is a very definite and controlling red right there. It's not screaming obnoxious. There's no feather, there's no spread, there's no shading. It is a beautifully performing red ink. I think I called the last one fine when it was medium. This broad is quite a bit darker than we got with that medium, and this is the red that I am really enjoying right here. The broad has no feather, no spread, no shading, just gorgeous redness on the page all the way through. So if you don't like shading, here is a great ink. The stub nib is darker than the medium was. It is still lighter than the broad. It has no feather, has no spread, no shading. It is a very delicious red on the page. Sounds kind of weird considering the name. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with
a Kaweco Sport with a medium nib, a Kaweco Sport with a broad nib, a Kaweco Sport with a 1.5 stub,
The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad.
Looking at the medium nib, we have a significantly lighter tone than we had on the Clairfontaine, which is really an effect of this paper eating up some of the vibrancy that this ink has. That aside, it has no feather, no spread, it's not shading. It definitely still looks red, just paler than we had with the Clairfontaine. The broad nib is just like the medium was lighter than the Clairfontaine. The broad, much darker than the medium on this paper, not as dark as we saw with the Clairfontaine. It's not bleeding, it's not spreading, it's not shading, it's looking very nice. I can definitely see this. This paper, I think, with a wet fine, could look good. The stub nib is lighter than the broad. It has no feather, no spread, no shading. It is a very well-performing, really nice color on the page. It's slightly darker than what we saw with the medium, but still not that same tone. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there's very little ghosting and there's no bleed through.
I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook.
Looking at the medium nib, it's a little bit darker, I think, than the last paper, maybe right about the same. There's no feather, no spread, no shading. It's a lighter red than I would prefer, and it's not having its best showing as a color on this paper. The particular tone of the paper combined with its absorbency is really making it not look as good. The broad nib is much darker than the medium with tiny feathers. There are some tiny feathers around, but I don't see this being something that's going to stop you from using it. There's no spread, there's no shading, so as reds go, this is spot on for what I would like to see. The stub nib is lighter than the broad, but still a little bit darker than the medium. It has no feather, no spread, no shading. It's really, it's funny because the red is not the right kind of red for me. But there's something about this red on the page that is very appealing. Even though I said I might not have that need for another bottle, I might get it just to put aside. Looking at the back of the page, you see minor ghosting, no bleed through, nothing touched the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it.
And here we see the results of the resistance test.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than we had on the last page. This paper is typically done fairly well with fountain pen ink, surprisingly. The medium has no feather, no spread, no shade, nice, consistent red all the way through. Would I like it to be a little bit darker than what I have here? Yes, but what I'm seeing is absolutely very nice. It's, for someone that doesn't like red inks, to say this is very nice, I think is a big deal. Looking at the broad nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the medium. There is a tiny bit of feathering that shows up, but you really have to go looking for it. Otherwise, it's really very good. There's no spread. There's no shading. I love the dark tone that this broad nib is giving me. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than the broad. It has no feather, no spread, no shading, great in how it works entirely. The fact that you can use this on this paper and not have any kind of a problem is a huge advantage. And as nice as it looks coming out of that stub, it's going to make simple notes look a whole lot better. Looking at the back of the page, there is a little bit of ghosting. I don't know about using the back of the page. It's going to be an up to you. However, there's no bleed through to the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Diamine Oxblood. Here is Noodler's Park Red. Here is Pelican 4001 Red. Here is Waterman Audacious Red.
The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook.
Looking at the medium nib, it is got quite a bit of feathering all over it. A lot of it. Quite noticeable. Do I think this is going to stop people from really using it here? No, but I don't think it looks good at all. There is a tiny little bit of spread. There's no shading. The color itself is a little more pale than we saw in some of the other papers. A little more pale than I would prefer for a red. I don't like this red on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it's much darker than we had with that medium. I think the tone is much more towards what we were getting out of some of the other papers, a little bit under that. It feathers, it spreads, it does not shade, but generally it looks kind of gross here other than the color. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit darker than the medium nib. There's feather, there's spread, there is no shading. It doesn't really make you want to be using this paper with this ink. This is a very inexpensively produced paper. Looking at the back of the page, that's not paper acne. That is a ton of circling of all of the spots. It's like all of the writing came through and touched the page underneath. And when you look at this, you see that massive amount that came through. You can practically read the back of the page from the back side. I probably can't use that page for a writing sample.
While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page.
Here is Caran d'Ache Hypnotic Turquoise. Here is Diatramentis Edgar Allan Poe Emerald Green. Here is Diamine 1864 Blue Black. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Edgar T. Steelworks Coal Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, it feathers. We expect that on copy paper. It spreads. We expect that on copy paper. It does not shade. We expect that on copy paper. It's performing exactly the way you would expect on horrendous paper. It's ugly. The broad nib takes everything that the medium nib did and did it bigger. So it feathers more, it spreads more, it doesn't shade. It is darker, though. It looks like I'm writing with a marker. But if that's what you're going for, hey man, I'm not there to judge. We're all judging you. But if you really want, you can go ahead and run that broad on this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it feathers, it spreads, it doesn't shade. These are all things that we expect on this paper. The real thing when we look at this paper, it becomes a matter of can you read what's been put down? And in all three of these, as much as I don't like them, I can say that I could read them. Looking at the back of the page, I was shocked that this did not come through and touch the page underneath. I was really expecting it. It didn't. There was plenty of ghosting. You can't use the back of the page, but there's no bleed through killing the page underneath.
Nib and Pen, do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This ink has a number of tones that it can give, and with that, I think a medium flow pen, maybe even a little bit wetter than just a little bit, not like a gusher, but it's going to give you a really great red. I like how dark the broad from that Kaweco was, which is really what I would love to get, and I can deal with that in any nib size, really, though I think I might really like how that looked with that medium and that stub nib, though I would probably personally go for a fine or a stub. The medium looked really good. It really popped on the page like that. I want that little bit darker, so if that Kaweco medium was what I was using, I would just open it up just a tad. I'd wet that pen just a little bit more. It will look so good.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.